Typhoid Mary Mallon, villain or victim? So let's get right into it. Over the years, Typhoid Mary's name has become synonymous with any spreader of an infectious disease. But there was a real-life woman and a tragic story behind that famous name. Just who was she, and how did she become so notorious? Typhoid Mary was Mary Mallon, a healthy carrier of typhoid fever who caused several outbreaks in the early 1900s. She infected dozens in the New York City area, at least 3 of whom perished. Once identified as the source, she became demonized by both the press and the public. Her nickname remains a disparaging term for anyone who knowingly or unknowingly spreads disease. Medically, however, Mary was the first healthy carrier of typhoid fever recognized in the United States. Mary Mallon was born in 1869 in Cookstown, Ireland. She emigrated alone to America in 1883 when she was just 15, living with an aunt and uncle. Like most Irish immigrant women, young Mary found a job as a servant in the homes of the wealthy. Mary realized she had a talent for cooking, which paid better than other domestic positions like laundress or maid. Working as a cook, however, she left the trail of disease wherever she worked. But ignorance, not malice, made Mary Mallon a killer. Typhoid fever is caused by the bacteria Salmonella typhi, which causes a high fever, severe headaches, abdominal pain, and in the most extreme cases, death. In the early 1900s, it killed about 1 in 10 people, or a mortality rate of about 10%. The disease is spread through contaminated water and food, so generally, typhoid was a disease of the poor. No healthy carriers had been documented in the United States, yet. In the summer of 1906, New York banker Charles Warren took his family on a much-anticipated vacation. They rented a lovely summer home in Oyster Bay, Long Island. The Warrens hired none other than Mary Mallon to be their summer cook. In August, one of the daughters contracted typhoid fever. Soon after, Mrs. Warren, 2 maids, a gardener, and yet another daughter all became ill. A total of 6 of the 11 people in the household became sick. The owner of the house hired sanitary engineer George Sober to investigate. They needed the proof the house wasn't contaminated in order to rent it out again. At first, Sober blamed a bad batch of clams, but some of the victims hadn't eaten them. Then he checked every inch of the property: the well, the water tank, the pantry, the privy, even the manure used to fertilize the gardens. They all checked out fine, so the source of the disease must have been a human carrier. Sober narrowed the culprit down to the cook, Mary Mallon, who left the family's employ at the end of the summer. He even pinpointed which meal had contaminated the victims. Most foods that a cook handles are raised to temperatures sufficient to make them harmless. However, one hot Sunday, Mary prepared a summer dessert which everybody loved: ice cream with freshly cut peaches. Mary's employment history showed that typhoid fever followed her from job to job. In 1902, when Mallon worked in the summer house of a wealthy New York lawyer, typhoid struck 7 out of 9 people, leaving only Mary and the owner standing. Mallon had worked at 7 jobs in 7 years in which 22 people had contracted typhoid, including 1 young girl who died. No one ever suspected the cook. George Sober knew this was more than coincidence, but he needed stool and blood samples from her to prove it. Mary turned out to be a hard woman to find as she moved around so much. In March 1907, after a 4-month search, Sober finally caught up with her, and what he found horrified him. Mary was working as a cook yet again in a house on Park Avenue on the east side. The laundress had just been taken to the Presbyterian Hospital with typhoid fever, and the only child, a daughter, was dying of it. Sober met Mary in the kitchen and explained as clearly as possible that she was inadvertently spreading typhoid to her employers. Then he asked her for samples of her urine, stools, and blood to test. But that's when George Sober got the first glimpse of Mary Mallone's famous temper. She seized the carving knife and stepped towards him. A shocked Sober ran back down the long hall, through an iron gate, and out onto the sidewalk. The next day, he confronted Mallon again, this time at a sad little boarding house where she had frequent visits with a certain disreputable gentleman. Sober tried again to explain that although she wasn't ill, Mary was spreading the germs that caused typhoid. But Mary erupted again, shouting curses I can't repeat here, and angrily denying all of it. She insisted she'd never had the disease, and was livid at such an unfair allegation. "Typhoid is everywhere," she shouted. Sober feared she'd leave her Park Avenue job and vanish into the city again, sickening and even killing others. He convinced the New York City Health Department to take her into custody. A female inspector, Dr. Josephine Baker, paid Mallon a visit and tried to persuade her to cooperate, but Mary slammed the door in her face. The next day, a health department ambulance with a police detachment arrived to arrest Mallon. Mary was ready, though. A long kitchen fork in her hand, she poked it at Dr. Baker's chest, who stumbled backward and bumped into a policeman. In the ensuing confusion, the resourceful Mary had disappeared. The police searched the house, eventually finding footprints in the backyard leading to a kitchen chair propped up against a wooden fence. They spent the next 5 hours scouring the neighborhood, until one sharp-eyed cop spotted a scrap of blue calico cloth caught in the door of a closet. Mary came out swearing and fighting, both of which she could do with amazing vigor. Baker made another effort to talk to her sensibly, but it was simply no use. Mary was convinced the law was persecuting her and insisted she had done nothing wrong. The policeman lifted her up and into the ambulance, and Baker had to sit on her all the way to the hospital. In custody, Mallon's stools tested positive for typhoid, yet she remained convinced of her innocence. George Sober visited her in the isolation ward at Parker Hospital. He knew she hadn't been running around the city intentionally making people sick. Nevertheless, bad hygiene caused her to spread the germs accidentally. He offered to set her free if she simply agreed to improve her hygiene. Mary declined in classic fashion. She rose from her chair, turned, entered the toilet, and slammed the door behind her. Sober later described Mary as about 5'6", blonde hair with Irish blue eyes, a healthy complexion, and a very determined jaw. She had a fit figure, though a bit on the heavy side. She prided herself on her work endurance and had a determined walk and mind. She could both read and write, seldom missing the daily paper. The health department quarantined her at Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island in the East River. She stayed in a cottage built for the hospital superintendent, with a living room, kitchen, bathroom, equipped with gas, electricity, and plumbing. It was likely the best she'd ever lived in her entire life, but Mary was isolated. The hospital delivered food, she cooked and ate it alone in her cottage. Mary Mallon had been taken by force against her will and was held without trial. So could the government lock her up indefinitely? The Board of Health was empowered to, quote, remove to a proper place any person sick with any contagious or infectious disease, end quote. But this was written before anyone knew of healthy carriers. Still, to many, locking up poor Mary just seemed wrong. Mary believed she was unfairly persecuted. She couldn't understand how she could have spread the disease when she herself was perfectly healthy. Quote, I never had typhoid fever in my life, and I've always been healthy. Why should I be banished like a leper and compelled to live in solitary confinement? End quote. During Mallon's quarantine, the hospital attempted to treat her, but nothing seemed to work. It seemed she was destined to remain a carrier for life. In 1909, after 2 years in confinement, she finally sued for release, on the grounds that she'd been denied due process and had never been charged with a crime. Quote, "This contention that I am a perpetual menace is simply not true. I have committed no crime, and I am treated like an outcast, a criminal." End quote. During Malone's quarantine, health officials had analyzed her stool samples at least once a week. The samples came back mostly positive for typhoid. The judge ruled in favor of the health department, and Mallon, now popularly known as Typhoid Mary, in the press and in the public, would stay in the isolated cottage on North Brother Island. A year later, in February of 1910, however, a new health commissioner decided that Mallon could go free as long as she never would work as a cook again. Anxious to regain her freedom, Mary accepted the conditions in an affidavit, saying she'd also take hygienic precautions to protect those with whom she came in contact. Mallon promised to check in with the health department every 3 months. She immediately broke that promise. None of the other domestic jobs available to a woman in 1910 paid as well as cook, and her working conditions in a factory was much less desirable. Plus, Mary still did not believe she had carried typhoid fever. George Sober described her as a hot-tempered, stubborn person. She never held a job more than a few months, moved often, and had trouble keeping friends. The other servants said she rarely socialized with them. Plus, Mary possessed that hot temper. She bounced from job to job, finding work via advertisements and employment agencies. Sober never found any of her relatives in America or Ireland, and Mary never mentioned any. A nurse at the hospital managed to get close enough to learn she'd had lovers, but met only stone silence when she pressed for more details. Mary sent for no one when she was incarcerated, and no one came forward later after her death. Doctors tried for years to convince her that, even though she was perfectly healthy, her body hosted the deadly bacteria, but she refused to believe them. She neglected basic hygiene, even when doctors urged her to wash her hands more often. Mary didn't run around New York infecting people like some deranged sociopath. She just didn't believe in science. Mary had no intention of following the health officials' orders. Not working as a cook pushed her into other domestic positions which simply did not pay as well. Still feeling perfectly healthy, Mary never believed she could spread typhoid. Mary tried being a laundress, but eventually went back to working as a cook. For the next 5 years, she worked under various aliases. The agencies that placed cooks in rich households knew Mallon by sight, so she instead worked in restaurants, hotels, and hospitals, where she risked exposing even larger numbers of people. About 84 subsequent cases are attributed to Mary Mallon, but George Sober suspects many more went accounted for. Then in 1915, George Sober got a disturbing call from an obstetrician at the Sloan Hospital for Women. A typhoid outbreak had struck and 25 people became sick and 2 had died. Evidence pointed to a recently hired cook, a Mary Brown. The doctor told Sober the staff had jokingly even named her Typhoid Mary. Sober immediately recognized Mallon's description and her handwriting. When the health department came for her this time, she didn't put up a fight. The public had shown Mary some sympathy during her first confinement because she was an unwitting carrier. All that sympathy vanished, however, this time. Typhoid Mary knew she was a carrier and unknowingly caused further pain and death. Using an alias made people feel that Mallon knew she was guilty. A much more subdued Mary Mallon spent the next 23 years of her life in quarantine on North Brother Island in the East River. The city continued to provide her the cottage and food for free. Mallon was even allowed to make regular visits to the mainland to shop for clothes. She helped around the tuberculosis hospital, even gaining the title of hospital helper in 1922. Sober said that in her later years she had lost the energy she possessed when she was younger. Mallon suffered a major stroke on Christmas morning, 1938, that left her paralyzed. She spent the final 6 years of her life in a hospital bed unable to walk, and died of pneumonia in November 1938. She was 69. Her funeral offered a final demonstration of the lonely life Typhoid Mary had led. Only 9 came to her funeral mass at St. Luke's Chapel, and none of them went to her gravesite. So why is Mary Mallon so infamously remembered? Why was she the only carrier isolated for life? Perhaps her very identity contributed. She received prejudice not only for being Irish and being a woman, but also for being a poor servant, unmarried, and childless. Though Mallon was the first carrier identified, she was not the only healthy carrier identified during that age. By the time Mallon died, over 400 other healthy carriers had been identified in New York alone, with none of those ever being quarantined.